How do we equip our families with a biblical worldview? How do we prepare the next generation for life? How do I grow in my walk with the Lord and in my marriage? If you wrestle with these questions, you are in the right place to find answers. Welcome to the Entrusting the Faith podcast. Two quick items before we get to our interview. First, if you go to our website at entrustingthefaith.com, scroll down to the bottom, sign up for our weekly emails so you know who is coming up on the podcast for the week and who you may have missed the previous week. You'll also get a free resource when you do, and you can find all our other podcasts on our website while you're there. Feel free to scroll through them, find other interviews to really help you along the way. Second, this episode is just brought to you by my book, Leading While at Home, How Husbands and Fathers Can Biblically Lead Their Families. So if you've ever thought, man, I want to be a godly husband or father, I don't know where to start, or you've heard that you need to do something to equip your family, but you just don't know where to begin, well, if this is you or anybody you know, Leading Well at Home will show you how you can love Jesus Christ, love and serve your wife and children, and take responsibility for discipling your family. You'll be encouraged and given action steps that you can apply so that you're moving forward. Okay, now let's jump into today's episode. Welcome to the Entrusting the Faith podcast. I am your host, Eric Rutherford, and I am excited today because my guest is Linda Lacour Hobar. She is the author of the Mystery of History curriculum, which is just a wonderful curriculum as an aside. She's a speaker, she's a mom, she's a wife. Most of all, she is a Christ follower. And so, Linda, so thankful that you joined us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. Now, for those listening who are not familiar with it, what is the Mystery of History curriculum?
Okay, well, it is a chronological Christian complete world history curriculum for all ages. So those are our 3 C's, that it's chronological Christian complete. Now, the truth is we have 4 volumes and they cover the 4 main eras of world history. So I'm going to start you right off with a pop quiz. Are you ready, Eric? This is for you and your listeners. Can you name the 4 major eras of world history? Just at a guess. What do you think they are?
I'm going to go with ancient.
That's correct. That's the first.
I'm going to go with the one right after Christ walked on earth. I know, is medieval in there?
That's it, medieval.
Okay.
Now, this is good because, see, everyone wants to be on the spot here because, we all struggle knowing our history. What's the third one?
So then
it's 2 R's.
I'm going to say is Renaissance in there somewhere?
Yes, I would put the Renaissance and Reformation together as most
Renaissance
others do.
and Reformation.
You've got one more.
Is this the modern?
Yes,
oh,
modern.
Wow.
There you go. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
they're the 4 major eras. So we have a volume to cover each time period.
Excellent. Oh, I love that. Chronological, Christian, and complete. So 4 volumes. So who is it designed for? Is it designed for all ages? Is it a narrow age group? Who uses it and when?
Mm-hmm. It really is for all ages, but I'll tell you why. You see, history is a living subject. But let me define that. So a living subject is one that does not require, say, mastery at one level to advance to the next level. We're talking about subjects that are open-ended, that are endless. So in that, you could include your earth sciences, history, Bible. You could study these things forever. But in contrast, there are stair-step subjects that we've all taken in school, which do require mastery to get to the next level, like, say, math, grammar, foreign language. Those are stair-step subjects. So world history, because it's living, it can be for anybody at any time. But I do have a fun example for you, okay? I think it would be the Trojan War. Picture that with a famous Trojan horse. truly any age can enjoy that story. So you could have a 4-year-old sit down and enjoy it because of that horse, but you can have an 84-year-old appreciate the exact same story. Now, obviously, what they both get out of it is different, but both can enjoy it. And the truth is, our primary audience is our homeschool families or families that are at home that just want to learn more than what they're getting in their classrooms. And so when you pull the whole family together, you really can bring everybody in. It's an ideal approach. In fact, I kind of like to see what the little guy gets compared to the bigger guy, because you just never know what they'll say, the little ones. But anyway, you can bring everyone in together. And if you are homeschooling, that really provides you less wear and tear on the teacher. So that as a parent teacher, you're not preparing, say, state history for one kid, American history for another, and medieval for another. It's like ideally you'd have all your kids in the same time period, which then when you start to do enrichment activities, really, just keeps going and everybody's in on the same thing.
I like that. I like that idea of having different ages together, different people learning the same subject, the same parts of history, yet probably picking up different things. It takes some of the pressure off. I like how you talked about that. It takes some of the pressure off of the teacher, the person instructing, especially in the home when you have multiple ages all around the same table or in the same room. That takes pressure off, which I'm all for taking pressure off of homeschool parents. That's a win in my book.
Yeah, we got to streamline where we can and when we can.
I love that. Now, as you go through the 4 different periods, is there repetition? Do you ever go backwards? Is it like on a 3 or a 4-year cycle, or is it you just go through ancient and then comes medieval and then Reformation, Renaissance, and then finally modern with your high school?
Sure. Good question. And ideally, if you start with them really young and they're just listening on a story level, you could easily get the mystery of history in, say volumes 1, 2, 3. You could probably get them in twice and maybe save our volume 4 for high school. I think it would be difficult to get all 4 volumes in 3 times, only because we usually want to see some additional subjects on our transcripts, in the social sciences, like, some state history, some American history, and this is world history. So really once or twice through is realistic, just depending on when you start. But you can jump in at any time. And ideally you go in order because of all the cause and effect in history. But if you had to, you could jump in, say, to the Renaissance, if you've already covered some ancient and medieval. So each volume will be a standalone, but ideally they go in order. Yes, you could recycle 1, 2, and 3 1 or 2 times. And volume 4, because it gets harder by all the themes as well as the reading level, that really is a good high school choice, or at least for 8th grade and up. Doesn't mean there isn't something in there for little guys, because I always picture the tag along, the younger sibling. So I give them hands-on things to do, even when we study the Nazis. In fact, can I share with you what we do when we get to the Nazis?
Oh, yeah, please
So
do.
obviously, the older student is really going to get the whole story of the Holocaust. But one of the activities I would have a younger student doing, who again is just tagging along, I'm not necessarily putting a 7-year-old in front of the story of the Holocaust. But if they're listening in because they've got a 9th grader in the family that's studying it, I'm going to have the younger student do something like look around their house and envision where they could hide someone from, quote, the bad guys if they had to, so that we really talk about heroism, or we talk about the value of life. So there's ways to gear even some of the most difficult history to any age that I think is appropriate. So I keep that in mind with all my books. That's why I do say they are for all ages.
I like that idea of conveying what happened historically, but doing so in a context that's age appropriate, but not sugarcoating it either. Right? The
Right.
bad things happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like though that for families, you can go through it together with everybody, just sort of going through the material at the same time. Now, when we'll harken back a few years to really when you decided you were going to write this and create this, what was the problem or were you trying to solve, or what need did you see that you're like, okay, I'm going to pour my heart and effort and all of myself into creating this curriculum?
Sure. Well, I would say one of my greatest incentives actually was birthed out of one of my own deficits. Funny how life works that way, doesn't it? But the truth is, I did not grow up with an understanding of the Bible, hardly at all. It wasn't a part of my life. I did not come to know the Lord personally until I was age 17, not when I was like 7, like some kids. So that meant that there was a very big gap in my understanding of who was Noah or Moses or Paul. These guys aren't people I really knew. And I knew when I had kids, I didn't want them to inherit my lack of Bible knowledge. But on top of that, what I wanted them to get was Bible and world history somehow all together on the same timeline. Because you see, I already loved world history. I had that down. I fell in love with in excuse me, I fell in love with world history in college because I had a professor that actually told stories. Instead of just giving me dates and events, he told stories. And I was like, what? This is in history. I didn't know that. I think he started with the Tudor family and Henry VIII. So, of course, I just fell for that as opposed to boring history I grew up on. I mean, I hated history as a kid, like most kids, in a traditional classroom would. But anyway, so I had this love for world history. I had a previous deficit of Bible history. I wanted it all together somehow. And 20 years ago, when I started, when I was homeschooling, these materials were not as readily available. Now, I didn't really think I was going to write this, but there came a day when I felt the Lord gave me the title, The Mystery of History. And I knew immediately what it was. I knew that the mystery would be the gospel in the context of world history. And man, I wrote a dedication page that very day to my kids. You can still find that dedication page in volume 1. I've retained it after 20 years because it, to me, goes back to that day I truly felt this calling in my heart. And, it rhymed. I have to give the Lord complete credit for that. I was not sitting around thinking about naming a history course. I felt like the Lord gave me the title.
I love that. Yeah, it is. The title itself, it rolls off the mouth. It is very memorable.
Mm.
But I also like what you were saying, how you you liked world history, but yet at the same time lacking this sort of biblical context or biblical knowledge, and not understanding even how everything lined up.
Mhm.
Uh, do you think so? From the people you encounter, whether they are at, homeschoolers, at conventions, whether just in our churches, do you think people have a good grasp on how biblical history sort of how it fits with the normal historical timeline?
No, it is still a deficit for most, don't you think? I mean, there's people I know well who have studied, say, ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome, and they know it well, but that does not mean that they could integrate that with a timeline of Bible figures. And I know, well versed, well knowledgeable pastors who tell me they know their Bible history so well, but yet they'll struggle to integrate that into the history of at least Greece and Rome. Egypt's a little bit easier just because of the stories that we have in relation to Egypt and the Israelites, but the Greeks and the Romans, it's a little hard to put those timelines together. So it's something we still struggle with. We tend to have these subjects compartmentalized. It's been that way for a long time. It's as if Bible history is reserved for Sunday school or vacation Bible school or seminary, and world history was reserved for a traditional classroom. So, Lord willing, I have broken that wall down, and imagine just this amazing learning center you could create without a wall to divide them. And you could have all the maps and all the timelines and all the subjects together in one room, including the costumes if it's a really fun classroom, which I recommend. So, yes, we're getting there. There are a few programs like mine, but they're rare. So that's kind of where my vision came from, was just wanting to bring it together.
Well, I love it because, and I'm one of those deficit people who compartmentalized, and so there are chunks of history. I understand how it's all connected, but there's much of it that isn't, and so I see the importance of it. Definitely, just being able to see from you know what we see in Scripture, like you said, Greece and Rome, but even then being able to connect that outward, because, as Jesus was walking the earth, there were people around the world who did not know him and would not know
Mhm.
him. And so, when they say go to the nations, that was a whole lot bigger place than what those disciples probably thought.
Right, right. It's a big world out there. Mhm.
It is.
And
Um,
good news for some of your listeners is that you don't have to know history to teach history. It is a subject that you can learn with your students. If you can read or just even listen by an audiobook, you can get a ton of history through our series. Even if you don't use our additional companion guide, which is the curriculum side, even if you were just taking the stories in, I think you and your kids can get more history than what most of us received. Because if we did get any history growing up, it was probably chopped up, not chronological.
and that's a good encouragement too, because I know sometimes there are subjects you feel more confident in walking into, and others that the confidence lacking the skill. So it's really good to hear these materials. You can teach history, learn it as you go, and
Hmm.
your families can enjoy it and learn too.
Hmm.
So what types of materials are included? Is it textbooks, online, something else? What's the materials look like?
Hmm. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 volumes. Those are all colorful hardback readers, and that's where you get the story. So there is the student reader, but in addition, each reader comes with a unique download code on the inside cover, which gives you access to like a 500-page resource. That's what we call our companion guide, and it's chock full of all the stuff that you might want to use if you're truly teaching at home. So there's pre-tests, hands-on enrichment activities, timeline work, mapping work, quizzes, literature lists, more and more. I like to look at it as our program is like a buffet style restaurant. Like, let's say you have a tray and you go through and you get your main dish. Okay, you get your meat. That's the history story that you find in the reader. But beyond that, you yourself pick the side dishes you want out of the companion guide, because you maybe can't get to everything. I don't even expect you to, but you take what you want. If you want to do a hands-on activity, choose one, but you don't have to. They don't make or break the program. If your family's like, oh man, we do want to do the timeline work, go for it. Maybe you want to skip the mapping. Maybe you want mapping only. You just pick and choose as your family is able, because certainly different seasons look different in our lives. So that's the gist of it. Now, I do, in addition, have lectures, a standalone lecture series, and I have online classes that are live and self paced. So for those that really want more, or you just need a teacher to help your kids be more accountable, like for high school, I'm your girl. And there's information about that on our website.
Wow, that is I'll say a vast resource curriculum library. Um, do you find, as you've talked with parents and who have used the curriculum, do you find that different learning styles fit in as far as how they use the material, whether it's with the maps, whether it's more hands-on, whether it's more reading? Do learning styles fit into that in any way?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one reason the companion guide has been so popular is that eventually we get to all the learning styles. I don't think there's a single one we miss. If you have an audio learner, well, we have audiobooks. If you have a strong reader, we have the student reader. If you have the little hands-on guy who just has to run around in circles and build things, well, we have enrichment activities like that for them. So the enrichment activities are actually divided by age group. Younger, which are going to be very sensory oriented. They get to dye things, eat things, act out things, all the fun stuff. Then the middle student, who's a little bit more, say, fourth or fifth grade up to eighth, he has to do a bit more paperwork as he is maturing and needs to learn to research some things. Whereas the older student really needs to do even more, because they're the ones that are going to begin to shape their worldview. And we want them to be able to analyze history, not just learn it, but apply it. So, yes, we have age appropriate enrichment activities all throughout. And again, you pick one, or one a day or one a month. It's really up to the family.
I like that. Some flexibility to be able to make it fit the people in your home. Man, that's encouraging. One question that just came to mind as we're rolling through this information concerns the maps. I think sometimes we overlook geography and maps. We just don't give much thought to it or give much credence to it. How have you seen like maps work in your curriculum to help us get a better feel for history and how things interact and who is opposed to who and who likes who and so forth?
Oh, yeah. Well, maps, my goodness. The map question. They're so cool. I do love them because they sort of fill in the cracks of the story. You know what I'm saying? If you're studying about the conflict between the Spartans and the Athenians, well, you need to look at how close they are in the Peloponnese. You need to know what the Peloponnese are. And then if back to Helen of Troy, you have to understand how they carried her across the Aegean Sea. And then, the other thing about maps and globes is they do help, I think, any age person gain perspective. We are but a speck on the globe, you and I. But I don't know, as a kid, maybe I was weird, but I used to spin the globe and just lay in my finger somewhere random and think, who lives there? And it's some obscure place off in a foreign land. And so maybe just out of curiosity, I've always been intrigued by all four corners of the earth and the globe. So yes, I give them mapping exercises every week that will correlate to what they're studying. And again, hopefully developing a heart for the world. Let's think about these people in remote corners. Who heard the gospel, who didn't hear the gospel, and why? What are their challenges? What's cool about these people? So yeah, I'm a big fan.
I love that. I love to just the idea of helping us understand how big the world is, how small we are in the world, how the gospel needs to, we're called to get the gospel to the world, and how the world is so much bigger than we really think it is. I
Mhm.
know we deal with Google and we deal with, the internet, and we can learn things from everywhere. And yet oftentimes in our heads, we are in this very little um, postage size piece of ground, at least in how we think.
Mhm.
So, how important is it for families, for kids? Apart from just the academic requirement of I need to check the history box. How important is it for us to know history, and what makes it important?
Mm. Well, one of the obvious benefits of history follows that old adage I'm sure you've heard. It said that those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And that's true. So if we don't know how other generations have fumbled and fought and scrapped for freedom, well, for one, we won't be able to hold on to it. By the way, freedom, and this may be obvious, but it really is an anomaly in history. It's not the norm. Freedom is a rare thing. And when it has existed, it's always been fought for. So we really need to understand how we arrived here, you and I, in this generation living in the free world. And we need to constantly be looking at how dictators rose in history to power so that we can prevent them from rising again. Tyranny has been more the norm historically speaking. So if you don't want to live under tyranny, which I don't, I need to continue to study history for these clues. How did generations before us break the shackles? What did they have to do to get there? Man has been clawing against evil and tyrants for a long time. We've got to see that, for one, to keep perspective, and also that we'll just recognize the evil when it comes knocking on our door.
I like that, especially that idea of all I can think of is eighth grade history, Miss Faffinger, and she repeated over and over and over again that history repeats itself. And
Hmm.
just exactly what you said, those who don't learn it are destined to repeat it. And so I think that's important. Um,
And I must say, theologically, it makes sense because man has fallen. And we really will continue to repeat so many of the same mistakes because man's not going to arrive all of a sudden on his own doing. but we still can learn. I mean, there's still things we want to prevent, and there's still dictators we'd like to block, and so forth and so on. But yeah, the nature of mankind is what is behind that repeat of the cycles of sin.
Yeah, and that's true. And I think that's something, as believers, I think that helps us. I think it gives us an inside view into history a little bit, because we see the fallenness. Or Lord willing, we understand our own fallenness, our own brokenness. And so we should not expect anything else in history or even in the world around us. Because, like you say, that it is biblical, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the world really doesn't help us here. It doesn't offer this explanation of man's fallenness and sin. Um, but Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, meaning that man can't fix himself, nor will he. And look at how many times man has tried. I mean, we've had our age of reason, we've had the Enlightenment. Today we have headlines and theories floating around. And the truth is, Marxism, which is kind of where we're drifting, it's built on a false premise that man can self-correct. I mean, Karl Marx, he was an atheist, and he really thought he could eliminate somehow the upper echelon, the bourgeoisie, the property owners, the capitalists. He thought if he could just take that part of society out, then he would eliminate greed and fix so many of man's problems. But it's just not true that could work, because greed comes from the fall, not from the accumulation of material wealth or the lack thereof. Yeah, man and his problems won't be solved by class warfare, but that's what Marx proposed. And we're still seeing a push for that today. Sorry, I jumped ahead on that one, but when we start talking about man's fallenness, we might as well apply it.
I agree. It's as we look around us, if we look through the lens of naturalism, if we look through the lens of, we'll call it anything but a biblical worldview, we think we can fix it on our own. And history has shown time and time again, like you're saying, every time we try, we just fail harder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do. Now, in the same token, let's be honest though, man is incredibly creative and innovative. So yes, we keep progressing in innovation. I mean, look at just the evolution of the cell phone. Oh my goodness, my mom grew up on a party line, and I grew up on a landline. Now we have cell phones. God only knows what we'll have 10 years from now. So yeah, man's pretty clever. I'm not saying he doesn't innovate, but his heart matters. They don't change. Man is going to struggle with sin and selfishness and greed and, quest for power and just all the things that man can be. We're going to struggle with without, redemption and intervention from the Lord.
I agree. It's better technology doesn't change the hearts of people.
Right.
So some people who are listening, they might understand the importance of history, but they think, well, I'm old. Okay, so I'm old. I almost used a telephone book reference, and we don't have those. We haven't had those for a long time. As if you're reading a telephone book, kind of boring. Some people think history is that way. What encouragement would you give to them? I know you said one of your college instructors started with story. Is
Mm-hmm.
that a good way to get into it? How would you encourage them?
Sure. Well, first, I will agree with a person who thinks history is boring in only in the sense of it was to me too when it wasn't taught right. So, yes, the average history book is horrible. Okay. And I have a theory why. So often, history books try to cover the entire history of the world in one book. I'm sure maybe you had one of these in, say, fifth grade, and then you had it again in eighth grade, and then maybe you had one as an 11th grader, and you get the entire history of the world in one book. And it's also written by a committee. Well, there's two things wrong there. For one, you had to squeeze out the stories about the people that make history interesting, because if you're trying to shove it all in one book, well, you're just grabbing a lot of events. And then these committees, I mean, they're trying to be so politically correct. And so What I've done with the mystery of history is, for one, I write as a singular voice. So I write like I talk as if I'm sitting right next to you. So for one, that's more engaging because as I'm describing something that maybe was awful, I might whisper in parentheses, can you even believe, so and so thought that way or something? I talk to the student. So that's more engaging. And then on the whole spreading it out, well, again, we put the history of the world in 4 volumes so that you can get the in between stories of the people, because people are interesting, not events. Can I give you my favorite example?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I'd say one of my favorite examples has to be that of Cleopatra. Now, I do this for fun. Say I'm at I don't know, a garage sale or flea market, and I find an old history book. I like to pick it up and I'll go to the index and look up Cleopatra, and it'll send me to a page number. And 9 out of 10 times, there is one paragraph about Cleopatra, and it'll say something along the lines of, she was the last of the Ptolemies. Well, there's a problem for one, because the word Ptolemy starts with a P, so you can't even pronounce it. That's difficult for most students. And second, you don't even know what that means. So that was her dynasty, but there's no context for what that means. But if you want to tell me the story of her wrapping herself up in a carpet to meet Julius Caesar for the first time so that they could take over the known world, then if you want to tell me that after he's assassinated on the windy Ides of March that she's going to marry Mark Antony, and then she and Mark Antony will lose the Battle of Actium on the sea to Octavian, who would rename himself Caesar Augustus, stay with me here, who made a decree that everyone should be taxed in their hometown. Therefore, Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem to fulfill where Christ would be born. Well, I'm going to start paying attention because that's interesting. That's the story of Cleopatra. That has nothing to do or little to do with her being the last of the Ptolemies and a queen of Egypt. It had everything to do with God putting her life on a timeline in such a way that even the birth of Christ would be influenced, when and where that happened, and fulfill prophecy. I'll just say, keep it about the people, and I don't think history will be boring.
I love that. And I think you're right. I think when you get down into individual people, individual stories, it makes all the difference when it's not simply factual, although facts are important,
Mhm.
but understanding these are real people living a real life in a real world. And all of it, like you say, it's chronological, but it's also there is a Christian timeline involved from creation through the fall, through Christ walking on earth, death and resurrection, ascension, through the church period that we're in now. All of it is connected. And so seeing that Cleopatra example was beautiful. I didn't know any of that
Ooh,
because apparently all I knew was Ptolemy was spelled weird.
with the P. Well, I think the story of Octavian becoming Caesar Augustus does surprise a few people. Maybe you are learning Roman history. You learn about the first and the second triumvirate. Octavian's one of those guys, but he changed his name to Caesar Augustus. And all of a sudden, we have the name of someone mentioned in the Bible, Caesar Augustus, who made the decree. And that's the Christmas story. And then hopefully the lights go on there that, oh, real history is in here.
And that's important. Seeing, getting that connection with real places and real people, because it, it doesn't it doesn't validate the authority of God in Scripture, but for believers, it's just another layer of confidence that we have.
That's a good way to put it. It's a layer of confidence. Yes. Hmm.
Why do we as parents need to make sure we're speaking? Um, we'll call it the historical context of the Bible, because unfortunately, eh, not all churches are created equal, and sometimes I think sometimes in our churches biblical history sort of is almost equated with mythology. It happened maybe sometime in the past, and we sort of don't ground it like, no, Abraham was real, and no, he was a real dude, and
Hmm.
all of these things. So, how is it? What do we need as parents? Why is that? Why do we need to continue speaking that historical context to our kids?
Hmm. I think the main reason you just touched upon, but it really is to give the Bible, I think, the credibility that it deserves as at least an accurate history book, which I believe it is. But another favorite example comes to my mind would be when you look at Assyrian history, not to be confused with Syrian, but Assyrian. The Assyrians were the ancient ones. They took time, believe it or not, to brag in their history books that they had taken out the Israelites, which is the story of the lost tribes of Israel that we get in the Bible. But sure enough, there was an Assyrian king. His name was Sargon, and he inscribed on his walls the whole story of the lost tribes of Israel. Now, shamefully, it was his father and brother who really took out the Israelites. That was Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser. But Sargon, once he stepped in, just wanted to take credit for it. So he inscribed on his walls that he had taken out these Israelites, and he named them, or he named them and numbered them. And so what that gives us is extra biblical information to give testimony to what the Bible tells us about the lost tribes of Israel, which, by the way, they were never really lost. That's just a nickname that Sunday school teachers would give them. It was the fall of the, kingdom of Israel. Another favorite would be, and again, just trying to connect it all, is when you look at the Battle of Marathon, which a lot of people know that story because we've heard of marathons. And that is the story of where Darius, a Persian king, he was defeated in a battle against the Greeks that happened out on the plain of Marathon. But what others don't realize is that Darius had a son that wanted to avenge his father's loss at the Battle of Marathon. That son's name was Xerxes. He's another powerful Persian king. Now, he was also defeated, but lo and behold, it was this Xerxes who had a wife named Vashti that was banished from his kingdom. So he hosted a beauty pageant to replace her. And I think you know the rest of the story. This is the story of Esther. Xerxes is also called Ahasuerus in the Bible, but many believe he's the one and the same person. So he picks Esther. She's born a Jewish girl, and as the Bible would say, for such a time as this, right, to help free her people from this decree of destruction against them. So yes, tying Bible history and world history together, the value is incredible, because I would much prefer that when my young girls, for example, would learn the story of Esther, I don't want them to just see that as some fairy tale, this beautiful rags to riches story, which it is a beautiful story, but I want them to understand that when she went up against that king, he was Xerxes, as in the son of Darius. He was a powerful king who really could have, put her to death for her request. So in the Mystery of History, Volume 1, just as one example, my students will learn first the Battle of Marathon and Darius. Then they're going to learn about Xerxes. Then they're going to learn about Esther and realize that her story from a historical context is extremely powerful. And again, not just a pretty story of a girl dressing up for the king.
Wow. I have to say, I'm blown away. Clearly, I have not read that part of the first volume of Mystery of History, because I would have remembered that. That is bringing history to life. That is making scripture very vibrant and connected. That's awesome stuff. Let me just, I don't have good words. That's all I know. That is phenomenal stuff.
Like, awesome. That's good. Well, they're God's stories, not mine.
It is. And do you think, because sometimes I think I'll just call it human pride, arrogance, or maybe my own. But I think sometimes we think everything, we need to know everything, right? So we need to have all the details and all the facts and all the sort of the history book, so to speak, of all of the hows and the whats and the everything. Do you think sometimes that gets us into trouble when we are looking at the Bible in terms of historical context, in terms of other things? I know this is a tangent question. But it just, as you're looking at history, we don't know everything, but we know many things. And so I was wondering just kind of what your take would be on that. Do you think do we discount history and scripture because we don't know all the details?
Oh, I like your question. Actually, I'm glad you threw in a tangent question. So I'll tell you what comes to my mind, because this is something I have to sort through as my my barriers. You know what I'm saying? Like, sure, I have studied the history of the world and done my best to try to put it in 4 volumes for children, but it's so humbling because I'm scratching the surface. It's like trying to count the stars. We map out a few constellations and draw lines to connect them, but then you just keep going and you keep going and you keep going. And history is so much like this. It is so endless. God alone knows every person who has ever lived because he is a personal God. Every single person that's ever lived is made in his image, which, by the way, is where we get our value and self-worth. It is from him. But back to history, I think of Thomas Aquinas, who tried to write volumes of theology when he was alive in the Middle Ages. And at the end of it, he said it was all straw. Straw. That was after he had written volumes of theology, because it's like he too realized he was scratching the surface of trying to put into words, you know, this story, because history really is this story of this God who decided to create, made us, let this all unfold, created us imperfectly that we might be drawn to him. And it's just a mind blow. We just can't even make sense of it. But, that's the whole gospel. It makes no sense to us. If it did, we'd be in trouble, I guess, right?
I think so. I love that too, just the way you're describing history. And I don't know that I've thought of it that way. Recently had an opportunity to go to oh goodness, now I can't think of what they're called, planetarium. And we're seeing the expanse of the universe and hearing how far things are apart from one another and how huge it is, and knowing that God set every star into place and created all just by speaking. I think as we look back at history, that is that same awe, right? As we look and
Hmm.
we realize how many people, and they all breathed, and he knew all the hairs on their head, and
Yeah.
he knows all their stories. Really kind of approaching history is really, when we see it in its expanse, like you're talking about, it just leaves us in awe
Hmm.
of who God is.
It also brings me comfort because we know, looking at history and looking at today, looking at the world at any given time, that there's so much suffering. So I find comfort knowing that he knows and collects those tears and cared for every soul, because again, we're made in his image. So he's not without caring.
It is a definite reminder that um, how big he is. And so
Hmm.
I am thankful, so thankful for that. Um, wow, this has been a great conversation. I think we are running towards the end of our time, but if listeners want to know more about you, more about Mystery of History, more about the materials, where would you like them to go?
All right. First and foremost, please visit our website. So I am also a vendor of my own work. There are companies that sell my work, but I also choose to do so. So if you go to themysteryofhistory.com, don't leave out themysteryofhistory.com, you will find all of our resources. That's also access to our online classes and lectures. And we have all 4 volumes. And we encourage people to shop by the time period, because that's how most people are approaching history. So if you need medieval times, go to volume 2, look what we have to offer. Most people, again, would start with ancient times because that is starting at creation. It goes up to the birth of Christ. But if you need to, move around and wiggle around through time, feel free. So again, we have 4 volumes represented. You can also find me on Facebook. I do have an author page there. So that's The Mystery of History. So that's my author page. So I'm there a lot to answer questions.
Excellent. So the mysteryofhistory.com. So if you're listening, make sure to check out that page. We're going to put that information in the show notes so you can check it out.
And if you subscribe to my newsletter, sorry, I always forget to throw
No,
that in there,
please.
but we have a free workshop to give you. And actually, the workshop is called When Bible History and World History Meet Face to Face. And that's where I will talk a little bit more about those Assyrians and a few other places where we do find world history and Bible history just right smack dab together, which I think, again, just strengthens our faith and as a result might strengthen the faith of our children. And that's what we're aiming for. It's a tall order to ask our children to obey the Bible. And so the more convinced we are of its absolute truth, the easier that's going to be.
Oh, I agree. Now, where do they go again to get that particular bonus?
If you go to my website, a little screen will pop up to subscribe. And upon subscribing to my newsletter, they'll get that free workshop. It's an MP4, so they get slides as well as audio.
Oh,
it's a good one to watch with your kids. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. So everybody listening, make sure you check that out. Wait for the pop-up, sign up for the newsletter, get the MP4 and the bonus material. You'll be encouraged. You're going to grow. Your kids will love it. Well, Linda, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Great information. So glad to be able to ask you some questions and just to be able to share this with the audience.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was really a pleasure. I mean, when I get a chance to talk about history, I kind of light up. So thank you for letting me do this with your crowd here today.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Wow, great conversation with Linda Hobar. 3 things that really jumped out at me. First, I liked how she talked about history is for anyone at any time, and that the Mystery of History curriculum can be used across various age groups at the same time. So it's not simply for a specific age group, but it's for everybody, and you can teach your kids depending on where they are on the spectrum. Second is that how she talked about the mystery of history would be the gospel in the context of world history. And so often we as believers, we may understand some biblical history, but being able to take it and really put it into what would be the world history timeline, we don't always have that information. And so it's really important that we see what is in the Bible. Not only is it true, but it occurred in real time and real space in history. And last, that idea that as we look at history, you go through archaeology, all of this extra biblical information just gives a testimony to what the Bible says being true. Now, even if we don't find everything in archaeology that the Bible says happened, that doesn't mean the Bible's not true. It just means we didn't find it in archaeology. So we always want to make sure we're approaching it in that context. But so much of what archaeology is discovering and finding today is just one more layer of proof that absolutely everything in the Bible is true. So great conversation with Linda. I would encourage you to check out her website, themysteryofhistory.com. Get some resources, and you'll just be encouraged. If you found this episode helpful, please leave a review for us wherever you listen to podcasts. Doing so will help others to find us. Check out the show notes for resource information. We encourage you to do that for links and other references. We'd like to hear from you, so you can message us your questions or comments on Facebook, Instagram, at Entrusting the Faith. You can email us at info@entrustingthefaith.com. If you go to our website, which is www.entrustingthefaith.com, you can sign up to our email list and receive free resources as well as upcoming podcast episode information. So check it out. Lastly, just remember, legacies are built a day at a time. So start now.